What is the PFL doing? That is a question that we all have, because it seems like a lot of the moves that they are making are very counterproductive. And I'm going to talk about that in today's video, because the PFL owner came out and made a statement about the UFC and Dana White by saying the PFL is to the UFC what Netflix was to Blockbuster, and he put out a quote that said, you know, Blockbuster used to think Netflix was a joke and didn't consider it competition, and then now, what do you know, Netflix is the biggest thing in the world, and Blockbuster is completely ruined and destroyed. So he was basically saying, hey, Dana White, UFC, you can laugh at us, the PFL now, but we're going to take over this MMA game. And I don't know if they can without some really massive rule changes that they need to make. We're going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about the fact that maybe they don't even want to take over the game, but they just want to be such an annoying competitor to deal with and deal with the comparisons of, that maybe the UFC will buy them out at some point, and that's how they'll make their money. Who knows? I want to talk about it in today's video. So we start straight away with the fact that PFL is never going to be on the UFC's level as long as they keep the rules that they have. Now, maybe this Grand Prix system that they have is just to gain initial promotion, get everyone talking about it, and then all of a sudden change the rules to something else now that they've got a bit of a fan base, and make it make a bit more sense. Because although the tournament format is really cool, it is a bit weird, because you see a lot of opponents pulling out of fights. They can't make a fight 8 weeks after they just had a fight. You can see a fighter get like his foot broken or his hand broken in the first round of the tournament, and now that guy, who might be the best fighter in the entire tournament, can't make it towards even the semi-finals of that tournament. So it's a bit weird there. But also, another thing that's weird about the PFL is that they don't allow elbows. They don't allow elbows in an MMA fight. That needs to change as soon as the PFL is ready to change it. Simple as that. You can't have a rival MMA promotion to the UFC and not allow elbows because you're worried about people getting cut. Therefore, they can't make it to the next stage of the tournament. That's a real thing. Okay, if you've ever watched the PFL, they're not allowed to throw elbows in case people get cut. That's a massive problem that PFL has, that they need to change the rules on immediately if they are going to be in competition with the UFC. So I personally think the move from the PFL would be, eventually, after a little bit of promotion, they spend however many more millions they're going to spend down the drain for the promotion of their company, they maybe get to a point where, okay, we've built our initial fan base. We have a bottom layer of MMA fans here that are going to watch our stuff. Now we change the rules. We tweak the competition rules that we have, tweak the ideas of the Grand Prix and stuff like that, and then maybe we allow elbows in an MMA fight, because that needs to be a thing. You can't have a rule where the problem with the rule is, and the reason why the rule is implemented is, you don't want people to get cut. That's really soy as a rule, and that definitely needs to change down the line. We also have other rules that I think should be implemented by the PFL. I think they should allow knees to a grounded opponent and soccer kicks. That's another thing that they can have as an edge over the UFC. It's the reason why ONE FC coming over to the US is a big deal, and my ONE FC actually does pressure the UFC a little bit, because ONE FC has a superior rule set to the UFC. And I think PFL need to be like, you know what, this tournament idea was fun, but we need to allow all the rules in MMA so that maybe we can have that edge over the UFC. We can be the promotion in MMA in the US where really everything's allowed. You know what I mean? You can't be the promotion that's trying to compete with the UFC. What's the PFL? Oh, it's like the UFC, but they're all worse by far as fighters, and you can't throw elbows for some bizarre reason. Why can't you throw elbows? They don't want them getting cut. Like that, you can't win that argument there. You need to be, you know, the PFL, it's that other promotion that's in the US. The fighters aren't as well known, and they're maybe not as good, but like they allow everything at the PFL. That's the full rule set of MMA. They have no rules. Aljo wouldn't exist in the PFL. And now you start having these conversations. If you have like a bantamweight champ at PFL that's winning by kneeing people that are a grounded opponent, all of a sudden the discussion comes up about what if Aljo, would Aljo really be champ if knees to a grounded opponent were allowed? And they have to change those rules. Elbows must be allowed. Knees to a grounded opponent must be allowed. And maybe at a push, soccer kicks as well need to be allowed at the PFL. They need to have something that the UFC doesn't. They can't compete with the UFC having less than the UFC has allowed. Doesn't make any sense. And that would put pressure on the UFC. There's other things that I find wrong with the PFL, and that is their spending of money. They're not going to make money for a very, very long time. And I don't know who's funding it or anything along those lines, but they must be putting in a whole bunch of money into this. A whole bunch of money. Because they are not making money right now. You look at some of the pay-per-view sales, I don't think they've done over 50k pay-per-view buys on a single card. BKFC do a good job of having that one big event. PFL, let's face it, if it wasn't for the MMA media, who are just absolutely rallying behind it, they wouldn't really have anything. You know what I mean? But the MMA media hate the UFC so much that they just sort of like you see this with Ariel, he overly praises the PFL, even though PFL at the lower levels does not pay their fighters good whatsoever. They only pay former UFC fighters well. And then it's disguised behind, $1 million check at the end of it all. Meanwhile, the guy who got knocked out in the first round has left with absolutely nothing whatsoever compared to a guy in the UFC who might make 12k. So the MMA media are really going to rally behind it. But the PFL, their problem is that they're spending so much money. And I know that's a good thing to do because you want the big name fighters. You want Ngannou. And they've got Ngannou. What can they do with Ngannou? Who knows? But they also need to snatch talent from the UFC. Not snatch old talent that's been in the UFC and done in the UFC. Don't do that. Don't just snatch Shane Burgos and bring him over and then just snatch Ngannou when he's ready and he's ready to take a downstep in competition. Take him for more money and freedom for 2 fights. Don't just snatch from the already UFC roster. Do what ONE FC did with Roberto Soldic. Snatch early, like Pat Barry. Snatch them early. You know what I mean? When they're young. You know what I'm saying? Take them. Like PFL just signed Lewis McGrillen. I think Lewis McGrillen is a potential superstar in MMA. Little ginger kid, bantamweight flyweight, one-punch knockout power, crazy highlight reels on his record so far. Hasn't fought anyone great yet, but if he's really good, I promise you he would have been a star in the UFC. One fight in the UFC, one debut, he would have been a star. PFL signed him up to PFL Europe on a multi-fight deal. It's a 2-fight deal at least. They've got Lewis McGrillen, who is a big up-and-coming name and knockout artist in the lower divisions. They got Cedric Doumbé. Now, Cedric Doumbé is, I believe, 30 years of age. So it's not like the UFC missed out on something crazy there. But ONE FC got Roberto Soldic, and the UFC got Dricus du Plessis. They were 1-1, and Soldic won the rematch. That's a W for ONE FC right there. PFL need to focus more on that. Winning low rather than winning high. They're winning against Ngannou by putting up the massive amount of money, and we'll have you for this, and we'll let you do whatever you want, Ngannou, anything. Basically being a complete walkover to Francis Ngannou just to get him in their promotion. I get it. It's Francis Ngannou. They should do that. But they need to win at the lower levels. PFL need to put their money, instead of it being in millions and millions and millions and millions in a Jake Paul circus act, they need to compete with their money on the lower end, where the UFC is like, sorry, dude, we know you got a bit of a following, but it's 10 for 10. You know what I mean? It's 12 for 12, 14 for 14. Yes, Paddy Pimblett, we know you sell out arenas in the UK, but it's 20 for 20. That's where the PFL need to come in on these young talented fighters and say, what's the UFC offering you? 10 for 10? We'll do 20 for 20. You can make a good career, couple fights in the PFL. They need to get these fighters when they're young. You know what I mean? Rather than spending all their money on who's leaving the UFC, we'll take him. That's what Bellator did. And that was the problem with Bellator. And maybe PFL does buy Bellator and it works out in the end. But the problem with Bellator was they were the guys that just bought people from the UFC, and then the UFC guys either became champ or looked completely washed up and not themselves anymore. You know what I mean? And it was always that narrative with Bellator. They're not the same level as the UFC. They're just taking the former UFC guys. They took Rory and Rory became champ. They took Gegard became champ. You know what I mean? It just became that. They took Ryan Bader became champ. Non-stop. You know what I mean? Sergio Pettis, they took him. He lost to Rob Font. He's champ at bantamweight. You know what I mean? Like, it just became that dumping ground for UFC talent, and that's not what the PFL should become. They should be competing at the lower level because, let me tell you the best product Bellator's ever made. Michael Chandler. UFC snatched him from Bellator. Snatched him from Bellator. Bellator born and raised, Michael Chandler. He came up at Bellator. He got known at Bellator. That's what they need to do. They need to take these fighters that are young, relatively unknown, but really talented, like if they would have spotted Muhammad Mokaev. And the UFC were saying, 10 for 10, Muhammad Mokaev, in your debut against Cody Durden. 10 for 10, 12 for 12, that's all we're doing. And then PFL goes, this guy's got a 24-0 amateur record, and he's won every fight as a pro. How about we do him for 30 for 30? You know what I mean? And we start putting in some money down there. So they need to put money on the lower end of the sport. But here's what I want to say towards the end of this video. I don't know if PFL really want to compete with the UFC and take over. The way they're running their business is almost trying to be annoying by taking people from the UFC like Francis Ngannou and trying to make these moves that they're trying to make. I get it. They're trying to be a promotion. But there's a part of me sometimes with these MMA promotions where, and it's the same way in boxing sometimes as well, where they're just trying to be such a competitive nuisance that they'll get bought out. Like what the UFC did with Strikeforce. Just buy it out. Forget the competition. Buy that. And maybe with PFL's mindset of, it doesn't matter if we're not making money and we're entirely in debt. Fork out another 20 million for Ngannou. You know what I mean? I know we're losing money and we can't sell a pay-per-view. And we're making literally $1 million on a pay-per-view. And we're paying out the fighters 10 million on the card. I know. Just keep taking more money in debt. You know what I mean? They just keep putting themselves in more and more debt. And it's like, what is the aim really here? Are you trying to be a legitimate promotion built up from the ground? I know you can't get it straight away without that type of funding. But are you trying to be a legit promotion from the ground up that's going to naturally build its fan base and actually be a competitor in the sport? Or are you just spending that money like nothing? Non-stop. Spend. What are they asking to buy it for? That's more than we spent. Boom. Profit. You know what I mean? It feels like that sometimes. And it shocks me the way they spend their money, because if Ngannou sells 50k pay-per-view buys, he's nowhere near going to make the PFL money. They're going to be millions and millions in losses for the Ngannou fights that they have. Ngannou won't sell over 50k pay-per-view buys. And 50k is being generous just because he's at the PFL. Because one thing these promotions don't do, you don't see a PFL embedded. You know what I mean? They are out there. They exist. You don't see them. You don't see an advert for it. You know what I mean? You don't see that. You don't see a crazy bit of promo that they put out. And I know they have their own Instagram page, and it's got a bit of a following, and I'm just going to check it right now to see how much of a following it has. 673,000 followers, and the posts have got literally hundreds of likes. So the question is, are they even trying to compete with the UFC? Because it feels like they aren't. It feels like they might just be trying to get bought out by the UFC. And that's always a problem. I think the best thing that they could possibly do, and I'll end it on this, the best thing you could do if you want to compete with the UFC is create like an Olympic style, international style, not PFL or this FL or this FL, World MMA Championships. Like, you are the world. You're something the UFC is not. You're not this FL, this FC, that FC. You are the World MMA Championships, the WMMAC, something massive, something that feels more than the UFC is. But the PFL just seem to be going down the road of let's spend this, spend that, spend this, spend more. Buy that guy, that guy, that guy. We got no money. We're losing money. What are we doing? I don't know what's going on with the PFL. And I need to legalize elbows, because that's a massive problem as well. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Toodle pip. I'll see you later. Goodbye.